Okay, so hi everybody. Today we are, having the first of our weekly sessions. We're going to be broadcasting live every single week, Thursday, 10 a.m. in Korea, which is 9 p.m. Eastern time. And we just want to bring this to, talk about some of the relevant topics. I know that these days, given the worldwide crisis that we are having, many people are starting to wonder what are going to be the next steps for their personal careers, what are going to be the next steps for their companies. But they also want to think about these things outside of the context of what the disease is happening and thinking a little bit more about things long term. So we've got Sung Lee on the call with us today. Sung has been a member of our community for quite some time, and we've got Jose Ramos that just joined. So Sung, how's it going? Can you give us a really quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I am trained in medicine and clinical research methods, and I have been conducting research in applied neuroscience and neurotechnology for about 8 years. And I have been on a kind of a sabbatical or sort of leave of absence from my very active research career for about a little over 2 years because my mother has needed some help here in Korea. So that's been a very interesting experience in and of itself. In any case, that's also been very growthful for me. And one of the things that I've been doing during that time, apart from caring for her, is to finally work on a book that I have been, planning to write about the brain and what I've learned about the brain. It's been in my thoughts for 10 plus years, and so during this sort of personal time for myself, caring for my mother, I also have been working on this book. So I'm very pleased for that. It wasn't planned that way. Nonetheless, it kind of transpired that way. And I'm about halfway through the first draft. And so it's a fun process.
When do you think the book is going to be completed?
So I am aiming to have a first draft done like within the next 6 to 8 weeks, and I would love to actually have it published by this summer, and that's my goal, and that's very ambitious for most writing timelines. A friend of mine who's written a few books has told me that that's way too soon. He thinks that I need at least another year, a year and a half. However, I'm keeping my own counsel, and I feel that I feel some urgency to get it out sooner rather than later.
I guess it also depends on how you publish, right? Because if you go through the traditional route of trying to get a major publisher to carry it, to stock it, that, could take some time. But if you take the more, modern route, I mean, some people might even say, why are you writing the whole book? Break it up into chunks, like release them online. Start gathering feedback, and once it's in a position where everybody likes it, you can re-edit and then publish it as a PDF. And then once that does well, then you can go talk to a publisher. Right. So I think you're taking like a halfway there approach where you're gonna get it done, and you're gonna publish it this summer, and then I think that's fairly reasonable.
Those are great thoughts, Mario. Thank you. And I have entertained some of those ideas, and I may do some hybrid of what you're talking about, and kind of the more traditional path. Thank you.
I mean, I think it takes some time, to kind of like think about what you want to publish. So I'd say that the timeline that you're on for the summer is good. And the only thing I would say is that if the summer comes around and it's partially complete, just consider it complete. Right? And I think that perfect is the enemy. What is that phrase, Jose? Perfect is the enemy of good, or perfect is the enemy of fast, or is better fast than perfect? Something like that.
Something like that.
Yes, yes. the enemy of the good is the better, is one version of it.
Right. Something along those lines. So for today, I do want these sessions that we're having to be, more conversational and more personal. But I do have a topic. And the reason I thought Sung would be a good fit is because of his previous work within, within a clinical setting. And the question is a question that Hesam brought up. So Hesam, do you wanna chime in now? I think people might have known of you because you've been in the background of a few of our videos, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about how the topic for today came up, and then we can take the conversation from there.
Okay, so okay,
Mhm.
can you see me?
Yep, we got
Okay,
you.
so yeah, no, so hello, I'm Hesan, and I'm working in Lighthouse, and I am mostly doing engaging with people and bringing up very interesting questions from them, and try to turn it into content or like the broadcast that we are doing right now, and try to talk with people online or offline, not recently, of course. So the topic, sorry, topic for today is as we were talking about our company message, I saw a phrase that it was uh, the impact is connected with human-centered design, and I was curious how. So my background is design, and I was quite familiar with what human-centered design. So I thought it as like more like device or service is thinking about how humans behave and how we are can be more natural or comfortable to use something. And I never thought it is connected with like impact, because it's more like society or environment, kind of more wide and like worldwide issue thing. So I asked it to Mario, and so we are going to talk about it today.
So I think that's an excellent question, right? What is the connection between impact and human-centered design? Because what Hesson said is really true, is that many times when people think about impact, they think about it within the context of societies, large scale impact. How do you, philosophically, how do you improve the human condition, right? The United Nations has these sustainable development goals, and there are many other organizations that are talking about making an impact. And then on the other hand, you have human-centered design, which is something that's heavily discussed during product design. At a very individual level, what is the experience that a specific person has when they are interacting with, the product that you are trying to build, or what are the current problems that they face that you could design a product around. Um, and so I think that it's not always obvious to people, but the very short answer that I would give to that is quite simple. It's that if you have a product that you develop through a human-centered design process, keep in mind that the human-centered design is not exclusively about your product features from an external point of view. And it's not only about the product experience, although that is a fundamental part of it, but it is about the customer's entire journey from the moment they start looking for a solution to their interactions, learning from you, to getting the product, to using the product, to being so happy with the product that they start telling their friends and family around it, and once they're ready, starting the cycle all over again because they were satisfied with you. And the easy connection is that if you do this well and you are satisfying customers by giving them something that is cost effective, and these days customers are very concerned with more than just having a nice product. They care about the materials of the product. Are they safe? Are they healthy? They care about the production of the product. Is this being made in factories where people are being treated ethically? And so if you take a human-centered design that satisfies one customer, and you hit all of these different points beyond just the superficial design, then as your business grows, that impact starts to go from one customer to 10 customers to 100 customers to 1,000 customers. And at that moment, you start having a change in society, towards better designed products, towards better customer experiences, and towards more sustainable ways of doing business. And so, quite simply, it's human-centered design. You look at one person as a representation of a larger group of people, of a larger demographic. And if and when you reach that larger demographic, then you are enacting social change. MIT, there's a professor from MIT, Scott Stern, that I really like. And one of the things that he teaches in his entrepreneurship class, and I think that this is one of the defining characteristics that I see that's different from the way entrepreneurship is taught at MIT versus other places, not just other universities, but other accelerators. Many times investors and entrepreneurs, they are making an assumption that the world is fixed and that you have a specific optimal strategy that you should just discover and follow. And what Scott Stern says is that what entrepreneurs do is that they use market forces. I'm paraphrasing, we could find his real quote later. But roughly what I got from him was that one of the critical roles of entrepreneurs is that they don't just accept the world as it is and try to figure out what's the optimal strategy within this world, but rather what they do is that they use market forces and an understanding of social dynamics to actually cause transformational change in society. Apple's secret is that they don't chase trends, they make them. The reason they make a lot of money is that they don't wait for technology adoption, they actually drive adoption of technologies. So on that thought, I'd like to turn over to Jose now, given that I'm talking about, my perceptions of things I heard at MIT, and you're actually working at MIT right now. So what do you see these days in terms of this theme, the connection between human-centered design and the capacity for social impact?
Okay, well, so, hello everybody. Sung, good to meet you there. Yesun, Semin, Mario, great to see you all. So this is actually a very pertinent topic in my almost daily discussions, the idea of human-centric design. And I want to take the opposite direction of what Mario just said, which was that you take something and extrapolate it to more people and more people and more people. MIT finds itself in a situation where they have put out their material out to the world, open courseware, other things, all these courses, everything's available to the world. So basically to anybody, everybody, for free. MIT was sued because the deaf community did not have access to this material because it was only on audio, video. There was some written material, but not enough. That lawsuit was settled recently, very, very recently. And as part of the settlement, any material MIT produces must have subtitling, captioning, a way to accommodate for the smaller population. So now here's human-centric design, which is it's the term of accessibility, if you want to call it that. Think about any app, because everybody, when it thinks about inventions, they think about apps. Is your app accessible? And there's even a term they're using now in the app development world, A11Y. Instead of saying accessibility, A11Y. This idea that can blind people use it? Can deaf people use it? And not just deaf, but also hard of hearing, older people. Some, maybe your mother has, some difficulty hearing. That's very common among older people. Even maybe the notifications that your app sends. If it's a high-pitched sound, an older person's not going to hear it. And that's human-centric design. But agreeing with Maria's point 100%, that you have to look at your market, and that market can change. That your assumptions can change. I'm making this app for young people, and all of a sudden it becomes very popular with everybody, and now all older people don't have access to it. That's a problem. People who can't read, people who have a hard time reading, people who have low vision. We always take the extremes of blind. Well, there's also people who are vision impaired. So, they can see, but what if maybe your text were bigger, or your audio was better, or all kinds of factors that have to be taken account in any kind of human-centric design if you're really going to provide accessibility. And now you're going to get into situations where, now that we've matured the app world, now it's everywhere. Now people are going to start demanding accessibility, and that's human-centric design to those humans. It's essential to them. We take it for granted that we are healthy, and we, all our senses work pretty well, but plenty of people don't have that. So, and I also agree with what Professor Stern mentions and others, having to do with this idea of just constantly pivoting. The term that's used. Something is not quite the way you thought it was. You pivot. You do something else. It's not a failure. One of my favorite expressions, and I forget who said it, but it's not. It's never failure. It's feedback. So you fail. Aha! I go this way now because that didn't work. So definitely a very pertinent and timely conversation. Just the idea of human-centric design for a large-scale product. Talk about a large-scale product, delivering content to anybody who wants it anywhere around the world, and now having to accommodate to a population that was not accounted for in your design.
I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead, Simon.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to comment. I think Jose made a really good point, because if you think about human-centric design and the fact of environmental impact, it was the excuse was economic reasons, right? It takes more money to do something eco-friendly. It takes more money to get your app into accessibility, to get captions, and you get into lawsuits, which the economic reason justifies, if we don't want to be sued, we have to do this, we have to make it more accessible, right? I think the trend started in that way, but nowadays I see more people just actively going in that direction, right? When we thought healthy, what we call normal people was for granted, that's not it anymore. Every person has some kind of disabilities. Every person does have, some limitations. And during that, I don't know if that's the right word, having a sense of that and having the accessibility features as a norm, where people, and that creates also an economic reason. I know you mentioned, Mario, when we were talking about impact and how using environmentally friendly goods, doing good for the impact, is actually a business decision rather than just feeling good, right? And I think for this human-centric design and accessibility, it's the same thing.
I think that you're totally right. And Jose, remember we met at Hub Week. There's a recent article came back on Manifest Boston about how we met. We also met another person at that same conference, Simon. I don't remember her name, but she was blind. She was an app developer. Mm-hmm. And we had this conversation with her about accessibility during one of the sessions. And what's really interesting about accessibility is that we normally think about it within the context of people that have some form of physical or psychological impediment. anytime that we talk about accessibility, we're like, well, somebody who's blind or somebody who's deaf or somebody who is on a wheelchair. And the truth is that accessibility doesn't just benefit people with these impediments. And in fact, if we were more mindful of the needs of accessible design, it would benefit all users as a whole. One really good example of this is, I think, car controls. Recent cars all have touch screens, but you know what? You shouldn't be taking your eyes off the road to control your radio. So even though the driver is not blind, the people who are designing the dashboards and the control systems for cars should assume that the driver is blind in that part, like their field of vision should be pointed somewhere else. And these interfaces should be designed to have tactile feedback. Oh, but it's voice controlled. Oh, voice controlled is not the same. It's voice controlling distracts you from the road almost as much as taking your eyes off the road.
And when the voice control button is touched.
Right. And so I think that's an interesting topic, that accessible design is not just beneficial in our traditional norms of design to avoid a lawsuit, that's conformant to like the ADA. People who have a medical impediment are protected by law and they can sue you. I think that we should take accessible design or the insight that we got. I think I'm taking somebody else's words. I don't remember her name. Maybe when somebody starts talking, I'll look her up real quickly. But the idea that accessible design really benefits for everybody within a wider range of dimensions. And Sung, you and I had a conversation a few months ago that I think is very relevant to innovators, because these days when we talk about human-centered design and we talk about impact, people usually think about these things within the context of entrepreneurs who can drop everything and live off of ramen for the next 3 to 6 months to try to get some fundamentally impactful idea out into the world. People that have enough resources to engage with corporate innovation. And the conversation that you and I had was, and I'm kind of like bringing this up to you on a very personal level, was that what is the room for innovators who have a mother to take care of? Innovators who have children at home. These are not like typical impediments that we categorize as accessibility. But the truth is, shouldn't our innovation initiatives and shouldn't our innovation efforts be accessible to those who don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars laying around and an extra 16 hours per day, 6 to 7 days a week? I think that people that have these real human concerns have a lot of insight and have a lot of personal experience that are fundamentally important within the process of innovation. And the question is, how do we bring them into the fold? How do we take their experiences and their situation and the resources that they bring that might not be time and finances, but in terms of a fundamental understanding of human problems, how do we make sure that we bring them in? So I'd like to turn it over to you, Sung. And I think we can brainstorm a little bit. If you tell us more, what is the current book that you're working on? Like, give us the cliff notes of the book and tell us, so what is, I'm just like throwing you on the spot. I give you a little bit of a warm up. What is the impact that you are trying to have in the world? And for the next 20 minutes or so, maybe we can help you brainstorm about, a human-centered approach, both for you as an innovator to work towards that impact, as well as an approach that you can take towards your potential audience or potential end users. So take it away, Sung. What is the impact you'd like to have on the world?
So Mario, first off, I'd like to say that you are doing right now what you just sort of queried about in terms of your question. How do we take people who are kind of in an unusual situation, right? I mean, they're not, in computer science graduate school at Stanford and deciding whether to drop out or not, right, to start their startup. Instead, they're, you know, at a very different stage of their lives, and they've got, you know, generational family issues going on, and they're not that kind of stereotype or sort of profile of many, you know, kind of entrepreneurs. And you're doing what you just asked about. I mean, you're reaching out to someone like me, and I really appreciate that. So I didn't expect to have a chance to share about what I'm doing, and you proactively reached out to someone in an unusual situation, and you're inviting them to kind of, you know, tell a bit about their story, which is always a helpful first step for anyone to, you know, kind of keep their ball moving, right? So I just want to, you know, kind of give a shout out to you right now for what you're doing right now.
Thank you. We're gonna clip that and we're gonna put it as a testimonial.
Sure, right. So, gosh, you had several questions in there, Mario, and I'll answer at least the one that's sort of the ones that kind of pop up, and I'll do my best not to go on because I really could talk at some length on some of these things. You know, in terms of the book, gosh, I feel like I even have to give a little bit of the backstory of this book, but yeah, you know what? Before I give much of the backstory, I'll do my best to give the book in like 2 or 3 sentences, kind of a sort of extended elevator pitch version of it, right? So the aim of the book is to share a perspective on human brain function, which particularly emphasizes its role as the organ of central command for anticipatory regulation and for orchestration of all body functions. So again, that's the role of the brain is for anticipatory regulation and for orchestration of all body functions. So that's a little bit technical, but it actually speaks to things that you guys have been talking about even on this call, right? So in other words, and let's break it down, let's parse it out. Anticipatory regulation is not the same as reactive feedback, right? So the idea with reactive feedback is you kind of see what happened in the world and then you kind of react to that. You literally kind of, you know, well, I mean, we pivot. I mean, we have to do that. That's adaptation. However, if you're able to anticipate reasonably to, you know, to whatever degree, you can't predict, we don't have crystal balls, but if you're able to anticipate what the issues are to the best of your ability and then kind of stem them off, well, you've actually saved yourself and everybody a whole lot of pain, haven't we, right? And so just to drill down on that idea just for a moment, that goes into 2 different paradigms for thinking about brain function. So those of you who've taken some biology, remember the idea of homeostasis, right? So homeostasis literally means stability through constancy. It's the foundational idea of modern physiology. The term was coined by Walter Cannon in Harvard in the 1920s. And basically it was a way to operationalize the study of biology using the tools of physics and chemistry from the 19th century, right? And it is based on, again, a reactive paradigm of science. You look what's going on in the world and you see how the mechanical factors play out, right? So you narrow down all your factors in the setting of a laboratory. So the anticipatory idea, that's been around in various ways and forms for quite a long time, right? I mean, even Pavlov in the early 20th century was showing how dogs will anticipate their digestive tract by hearing or by smelling food or whatnot, right? They can be conditioned to start their digestive tract going simply by hearing a bell, right? Pavlovian conditioning is an example of anticipatory regulation. So this in itself, the kernel of the idea is not new. However, it hasn't really been fully fleshed out for its implications, right? And the person who did that most beautifully was a gentleman named Peter Sterling. He's a neuroscientist who was at Penn, but he got this idea in the 1960s and 70s when he was realizing that African Americans, when they had high blood pressure, well, that wasn't probably because of, you know, just heart dysfunction or their kidneys were going bad or something like that. There was something that was effectively programming their blood pressure to be high, right? This was the 60s, the civil rights movement. He was canvassing in Ohio in these ghettos, and he realized that, these people, their brains were orchestrating their blood pressure to be high. You can't say that there's something wrong with their heart and their blood vessels and kidneys and so forth, right? And so he coined this term allostasis to talk about how the brain is orchestrating the body based on what it anticipates the needs to be, right? And so high blood pressure is a kind of a natural outcome of a stressful environment, right? And so we all kind of know that. That's kind of grandma's wisdom. We know that when we're stressed out, our health goes sort of south, right? However, we're not really in a place to sort of act on that so well from a biomedical point of view for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect, right? And you see that disconnect play out in the economy, in the sort of disjunction between the medical space and the wellness space, right? People understand they need to take care of their stress to manage their well-being, and that's why there's even a huge economy around that now. They know that impacts their health. Strictly speaking, there's a kind of a firewall, though, between that idea and the medical idea that, well, sometimes disease is just disease, and it's got laboratory-based factors, and that's it, right? You don't talk about the mind-body connection, right? So there's almost this kind of, again, sort of church-state separation between these two paradigms, right? That's adaptive in some ways for all kinds of reasons. In other ways, it may not be so adaptive, right? And that could be, my friend tells me that topic alone is a whole book, right? And it probably is, but I don't want it to become the whole book, right? But it is the beginning idea: homeostasis versus allostasis, stability through constancy versus allostasis being stability through change. So Sterling called this idea allostasis to sort of, effectively go on the coattails of Cannon. Again, Cannon called it homeostasis. Stasis meaning stability, homeo meaning similitude, allostasis actually meaning change. And so the idea is that you literally are stable through change. You're always shifting your set points of your biological operations as a consequence of whatever context you're anticipating that you're going to need to deal with, right? And so it's the brain that's making those orchestrations. So that's the allostasis idea.
So what I find
maybe I should pause there. I can go on, but maybe I'll pause for now. Comments or questions about
I do want to make a comment here, and I have a question for you, because I do want you to go on something that you kind of skipped over a little bit. But so basically, what you're talking about is that there's these different views of the brain being reactive versus anticipatory. Like either you react or you anticipate something, and that it's grandma's wisdom that if you are in a stressful situation, your blood pressure and your fight or flight response is going to be triggered, right?
Precisely.
I think that one of the I'm not going to call him grandma because he could beat me up, I guess, but Wayne Gretzky, his famous quote, "I skate to where the hockey puck is going, not where it's been," is precisely what he's doing. And in one of our previous conversations, we were talking about business goals. Do you remember, Sung? And we were talking about fast goals versus smart goals. And I think that reflects the same phenomenon where the people who made smart goals, the constraints of those smart goals are enforcing on them to be reactive to what are the resources that I already have that are available? What are the things that people already understand basically smart goals are propose to us something that you already know can be done. And that eliminates any capability for innovation. Whereas fast goals are like, tell us what you'd like to do and let's see how close we can get to that. And in the process, we'll probably end up in a good place. And from a business perspective, we saw that that's limitation. So you said that within the medical field, reasons you don't want to get into have been preventing this change. And what I want to tease out of you is, can you actually tell us what are some of these reasons? I know that it would be a really long conversation, but I think it's important because many times to get ourselves to a position where we could do something, we don't just have to talk about what we would like to do. We have to talk about the barriers preventing us from getting there. So what are some of those situations that the healthcare, um, is it researchers, is it hospitals, is it insurance companies that are not allowing us to make that change?
So I'm going to share two ideas right now, and maybe they'll sort of lead into a third idea. And the first idea is it's actually what I'm going to call this a very positive reason why we have what, and I never even used this language before, but that's why I love these conversations. You know, sometimes it encourages us to come up with a new concept on the fly. I never used really that kind of, church and state kind of, analogy, but there's a certain kind of, there's some use to that. And this is a positive reason why we have this homeostatic paradigm of focusing on, the kind of reactive feedback and the laboratory definition of disease. I when I was in college, I actually studied history before I went into medical school, and I loved the history of science. And I actually think of homeostasis as being a kind of a moral revolution in healthcare. Because if you think about what we had before we had an objective scientific method where you sort of, boil things down to what you can observe in a laboratory, well, we had a lot of other crazy stuff, right? I mean, I use that term kind of loosely and without, being pejorative, but we have a combination of idiosyncratic religious beliefs and, shamanism and faith healing and mesmerism and all kinds of, sort of things that are, I mean, some of these things are very valid, and I have nothing against shamans, right? And many people, do very well with their religious faith. So, all these things are wonderful. Nonetheless, there's, as we all know, there's a lot of potential for abuse, right? Of sort of, these sorts of, kind of abuse of grandma's wisdom, put it that way, right? I mean, grandma's wisdom is subject to abuse and exploitation. And so what Walter Cannon does is not only is he, picking up where, Claude Bernard from France, who's really the originator of the homeostasis concept and its essential idea. So what Cannon does is not only take, again, a physicalist, mechanical, and scientific approach to biology. He's also, again, enacting what I call, again, a moral revolution in the sense that we're not going to judge each other for using grandma's wisdom poorly. Oh, you're a bad person. Obviously, you're sick. You must have sinned against God, right? You have impure thoughts, and that's why you're not well, right? And actually, this pandemic, this is a judgment from God, right? I mean, actually, we can see how close we still are to some of these worldviews that have not benefited yet from canon and homeostasis, right? Where we use very idiosyncratic beliefs to exploit or abuse grandma's wisdom in ways that do not help anyone, right? And so, the science of the laboratory and homeostatic, theories of disease and health is very helpful for creating an objective platform for people to look at a situation. And you don't walk into a person's room that they're very sick and just say that, oh, well, why are you such a bad person that you brought this illness in yourself, right? Instead, you're going to take a very close objective look at what their physical, situation is, right? So homeostatic medicine is a very good thing for all those reasons. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and I also think we're gonna get into a lot of trouble because we're kicking off one of our first conversations criticizing religion and criticizing grandmas, and I feel we're hopefully we don't get a lot of hate, but on a more serious note, I think I'm glad that you brought that up because what we find, and I want to be a little bit careful here because I don't want to encourage people to be skeptical of science and of the establishment of institutions because that could be harmful in and of itself. However, I think that you're completely right, and what we have seen, in the economy and in healthcare as well, is that there's a lot of idiosyncratic beliefs that actually drive institutions. and people within institutions sometimes are having a little bit of an uphill battle. Going back to our idea of, is innovation accessible to someone who is not a CS graduate that could have and should drop out of school? You know, another area where MIT has done a lot of research to come out and say, hey, no way, tech entrepreneurs are not 20-year-olds. Don't structure your portfolios around what do 20-year-olds coming out of university do. We're not saying don't listen to them either, but research that MIT has done is say, hey, you know what? If you look at who is actually successful in entrepreneurship, it turns out that they are closer to like 45 years old, right? That they've had a career, they have industry connections. So I find that within this area of one of the reasons I keep up to date with a lot of publications from MIT is that they have researchers who are working against a lot of idiosyncratic beliefs in the economy that are leading us to misallocate resources. So I actually I'm glad that you brought that up. And I know a lot about the battle against idiosyncratic beliefs within the economy and within innovation. Jose, what have you heard, or do you have any references or any material that you've been aware of where, whether it's MIT or other researchers, where they are trying to battle, idiosyncratic beliefs in the current pipeline for research and delivery of modern therapies and treatments?
Well, there's certainly research in even the development of conspiracy theories. There's research on that. There's this whole 5G craze going on, that somehow 5G is connected to coronavirus, and there are people looking at that, and looking at it not just in this situation but in past situations. There's always been almost like a need to find an explanation, and because there isn't one, or there's not a clear enough one, then you find kind of an easy one to blame, and there you put your blame there, just like, let's say, kind of to Sung's point, blaming witches for something in Salem and burning them because they were the cause of somebody's sickness, or I don't know, whatever. So there's definitely you can look at a lot of research with having to do with those outliers of what is causing this idiosyncratic behavior or ideas, especially in the area of conspiracy theories. So I think also there's a lot of, basically, social scientists would be the ones, who would be sociologists and social scientists that would be looking into this. And I think today, with so much information out there, and social media, of course, feeding into that and being a perfect outlet of anonymity, then that's probably exacerbated the situation. I wanted to something that both of you mentioned. I had never made this connection until just now, and which is kind of related to both the to homeostasis and allostasis, but also the smart versus fast goals. And for people who may look at this and watch us talking about this, and I'm not that smart to remember all of them, but so you have your specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound, right? SMART goals. Right. Then you have the fast ones, and for some reason I had the MIT Slow Management Review, which is comparing the two of them. Article, yeah, fast, frequently discussed, ambitious, specific, and transparent. If anybody's read Carol Dweck's book Mindset, that book evaluates people who have a fixed mindset, which you could compare it to either homeostasis or smart, versus a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. Fixed mindset, growth. So fixed mindset, homeostasis, almost fixed, right? Homeostasis is fixed; it stays within its bounds. A growth mindset, on the other hand, anticipates, or it's looking to anticipate, and is happy to anticipate. And it's also trying to be fast. It changes. It's ambitious. It tries to be transparent. It tries to look beyond the horizon and try to find well, maybe I can learn something from this. And that's one person who's done research on trying to figure out the difference between people who are working within bounds and people who are not, and then the big difference there, and that it can be changed, that it can be taught also. And so I kind of diverged a little bit, started with the whole issue of idiosyncratic research, especially as it relates to conspiracy theories, which is something unusual, or it's almost a constant in these in difficult times. 9/11 conspiracies, tons of those, and now we're getting into the whole COVID-19 conspiracies. So, but yeah, this whole I had not made that connection between the fixed mindset and growth mindset until just now, because this discussion going on.
Right. Sung?
Thank you, both of you. And I'd like to say a little bit briefly about what both of you shared there. First, to Mario, you've caught me at a funny time because I've got all these ideas sort of welling up in me, and I haven't talked really about them at length to a lot of people. That's why I'm writing this book. And I'm sure I say some things with a certain kind of passion that might sound like they might contain some opinions which I don't have, right? And so I'd like to be clear that when I say that, homeostasis helped to sort of systematize, a way of thinking about health and disease, for example, that was able to perhaps, overcome some of the idiosyncrasies or even, abusive, possibilities of variety of other kinds of beliefs. I do not, again, mean any level of, every day I'm reminded of mother's wisdom, literally, living here, caring for my mother. And actually, one part of my career, when I was finishing up my fellowship and getting into, my sort of research choice, I was actually very much in the research of mind, body, and alternative healthcare practices. So I come to these, various forms of grandmother's wisdom with enormous appreciation, right? I think the first essay I ever wrote in medical school actually was a kind of a commentary on electronic fetal monitoring, which is a technology, if you've ever been in an obstetrics ward, there's that machine in the corner of the room where the woman is having their fetal heart rate monitored to detect stress in the fetus, right? And I had learned from one of the pioneers of evidence-based medicine, who had gone through, he had been one of the leaders and actually in helping getting that technology brought into obstetrics. And he told the medical students very candidly, this was one of my own sort of, scales falling from the eyes moments during medical school, that, he had regrets about the way that his generation had shepherded in EFM technology, electronic fetal monitoring technology, too quickly into obstetrics because they just assumed it would work because, it's so obvious, you got a machine here, you don't need someone to do this intermittent auscultation of the nurse. Well, as it turns out, lots of controlled trials have now shown that you don't really see much of a benefit using those machines compared to intermittent auscultation by a human attendant, right? There's very little benefit in morbidity or mortality, maybe a little bit for, postnatal seizures or various other little things, but there is a big difference in terms of cesarean section rate. You get a much higher rate of cesarean section when you have that machine connected to the pregnant woman because, they're defensive. They need to interpret every tracing as a potential indication of distress. And so there's a much higher likelihood that woman is going to go into a cesarean delivery, right? And actually, the end of this essay, and I wrote this thing a long time ago in medical school, is wow, we really have kind of we seem to be missing the maternal wisdom piece here, right? In the way we adopt new technologies. We need to pause a little bit before we jump the gun on something that seems to be obviously good just because it's mechanistically sound. We need to think about, you know, the whole picture. And if we use that part of the brain that kind of is connected to maternal wisdom, maybe we won't make a leap too fast to introduce some technologies that might not be, human-centric, right? I mean, to bring it back to our topic, right? And so, I mean, he was this, I'll give you his name. His name is David Grimes. And he was, again, a pioneer in evidence-based medicine for 20 years, and he continues to do all kinds of work in obstetrics and propagation of evidence-based practices. And I was actually on his rotation as a third-year medical student in obstetrics at the University of California, San Francisco, you know, back in the 90s. And it was very impactful to me to watch him and to hear him effectively give a version of what we're talking about again, you know, human-centric design, right? And actually on the opposite side of it, sometimes human-centric design means don't introduce something that is not shown to be, right, likely to benefit people. And so then the other thing I just wanted to share very briefly is to Jose's point, I also really like how you're recognizing that it is a kind of a cognitive mindset when we talk about the distinction between homeostasis and allostasis. And again, if you talk from like the history of science perspective, and I don't know if you've heard Thomas Kuhn, you know, famous historian of science from Harvard back in the 60s and 70s, he's the one who gave us this idea of a paradigm shift, right? And so, you know, we talk about paradigm shift all the time. When he first introduced that term in the early 60s, he had a very technical way of talking about paradigm shift. And, you know, I don't want to like sort of diverge off into a lecture on history of science, but I thought it was wonderful that what he used to really, you know, really make that point was a famous illustration from a 19th century German magazine. And if I mention this, you'll probably remember it. You see a whole bunch of black lines, right? Which if you interpret it one way, it looks like a duck. And if you interpret it a different way, it looks like a rabbit, right? Mm-hmm. It's the exact same black lines. It's just that you can see it either way. And that image is actually from, again, you know, it goes back to the late 19th century. And actually Ludwig Wittgenstein also used it. Thomas Kuhn used it. It's a very important image. And, you know, we kind of take it for granted, people that are kind of familiar with cognitive psychology and so forth. But the importance of that is still yet to be fully appreciated because it speaks to what Jose just mentioned. Are you able to fluidly go back and forth between seeing the same set of so-called objective data as a rabbit or a duck and not get locked down onto one? I had a trauma and therefore bad, right? Well, no, actually, it sounds so cliche, but it's a real thing. Crisis is opportunity, right? And so can you take this same objective circumstance and can you turn it into something else, right? And we all can do that. And that speaks back to your question, or I'm sorry, one of you mentioned it. I think it was Jose, thank you. Can you teach this, right? How can you actually teach people to be more cognitively flexible and to really kind of, you know, use every situation for a positive opportunity, right? So these are all topics that I love to sort of, you know, embrace.
So I think that idea of being, cognitively flexible, especially to solve problems or to face situations with uncertainty, it applies to the same situation you were just talking about when they released these electronic monitoring devices, because, you know, as you said, I think absolutely right. You know, the same idea was starting to form in my head. Are we talking about human-centered design right here? And you're absolutely right. It's a human-centered design problem. Yes, we know the technology works, but how can this technology be implemented in a way that achieves the goal of care towards this mother instead of, creating a situation where it introduces uncertainty and anxiety so that they decide to have an increase in number in cesareans? And we can see that at the individual level. And then thinking about the aggregation of that, I don't even think I can mention any clear link right now from the individual to the larger society, but I can tell you this for a fact. In the last few decades, maternal mortality in the United States has actually been increasing. It shouldn't. It's a first world country with all of these amazing technologies. Yet somehow, I think we have one anecdotal data point in what you just mentioned at the social scale. In and of itself, it's not anecdotal, it's a study. But this study and the results from this study that showed an increase in cesarean sections, I think is one data point to this larger trend of, are we using science and technology to actually achieve our goals, which I would hope would be healthier mothers and healthier babies. I mean, it just seems so natural to me that that should be our larger social goals, and that our solutions should be human-centric in the pursuit of those goals. And you showed a case where at the micro level it failed, and at the macro level the data is showing us a failure as well. And I think that definitely we fall back into this. I think that now we have thank you so much for sharing that, because that's a clear indication of how idiosyncratic behavior can have the wrong results. These researchers, these designers, these inventors were being idiosyncratic in their thinking that electronic monitoring is a great technology and it gives us great information, therefore we should just roll it out without, considering the design.
And Mario, thank you. I don't know if I'm going to end up talking too much or monopolize here. I had no idea you're going to even give me the floor, so much on this talk today. But since we're on this topic, I'd just like to at least share this one more thing. And I'm not being a cynic here, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the motivations of the players. That's not really or to blame anyone. This isn't a blame game. Let me put it that way. Nonetheless, I think it would be sort of silly if we didn't, recognize and be clear that our healthcare system does incentivize a great deal of behavior in different kinds of ways through various, financial, levers. And, I haven't done a deep dive on the research of that particular technology, but from my prejudicial opinion, and I think from things that Dr. Grimes himself probably said back then, one of the questions was, well, is this going to save us money? And they thought it was a no-brainer, right? I mean, obviously it costs a lot of money to have, human nurses or attendants checking in on the pregnant woman, repeatedly. That's labor, right? Whereas if you just have a machine in the corner of the room that's just, checking them, well, that you buy the machine once and, no more costs, right? And so obviously there was an incentive to maybe, jump toward the technology, which again, later, various, stakeholders have agreed was maybe not the best thing that should have been done, right? And to extend that point, Mario, I think it's wonderful that there are all kinds of, interesting, solutions which don't cost money, right? And this anecdote is a little bit off topic, but not too far. It's actually pretty close. As some of you have probably been familiar with some of the writings of Atul Gawande. He's one of the foremost physician writers of our generation. He's formerly a surgeon at Mass General, and one of his first books was an amazing little book called The Checklist Manifesto, right? And I think he was like a junior faculty at Harvard, probably in the, early aughts or something like that. And the World Health Organization reached out to him and said, you know what, can you help us find out a way to improve surgical outcomes, across different countries in the world, in Africa and Russia, all these different places, right? I mean, you're a smart guy, you're a health outcomes researcher, you're a surgeon from Harvard, all these things, right? And so, he said, sure, I'll do that. And he came into it with some level of prejudice, which I think a lot of people would. Well, if you want to improve surgical outcomes in all these different places around the world, this is the basic level of, minimum kind of, anesthesia machine you need. This is the minimum number of scalpels that are surgically, sterilized that should be in the OR, right? Or whatever, right? I mean, a lot of people would think that way. I'm sure I would have too. He's actually came to a very different conclusion. After doing research, which actually he did some deep dives into the airline industry to find out how they prevent disasters in flying a jet craft. And he figured out that, there's a different way to minimize harms in the OR. You know what it is? It was fascinating. It was communication. You had to have all the members of the team check in with each other about some core things that you better do before you take a knife to somebody's body. Everybody identify themselves in the OR. Everybody identify their role. Everybody identify the patient and what the surgery is and why it's supposed to happen, where it's supposed to happen, the left arm or the right arm, and so forth. Everybody identify, make sure there's enough blood, okay, the proper units of blood that match this patient's type that are on available in case the person hemorrhages, right? Very basic stuff. You don't actually need any new technology. You just got to do the basics well, right? And then it comes full circle. He tells the final anecdote in his book is, this my own checklist came and saved my own rear end, because at Harvard one day he went through his own checklist and he made sure that he had the right kind of blood in the OR, which he might not have done if he hadn't been careful and developed that through his own checklist, right? And so right. So I don't want to go on and on about this too much, but again, the point being, that was not a costly solution. And it could be incentivized in different ways if we, find ways to jigger the system, right, to kind of support those kinds of, low tech but very effective, strategies.
Right. And you're right. I mean, this conversation can really take us into a lot of interesting directions. It invites the question of, what do we do in our healthcare system to cut costs that lead us to idiosyncratic decisions, sometimes ignoring real solutions that don't cost. And the other side of the coin is, what are the incentives for revenue? Because if we go back to the case of pregnant women, well, I'm pretty sure a C-section is more expensive than a natural birth. And so
yeah, right.
The cynic in me would imagine that hospital administrators that are like, wait, if we install that machine, we save money on nurses, and you're telling me that the mothers are going to choose an elective surgery? I'm all in. And surgeries have a tendency for complications, and maybe this is not the sole determinant, but it's a contributor to the complications that women have been facing in getting maternal health care in the United States, right? So I think this is a fascinating topic, and maybe for a future call, we can we can pick up on this and talk more about these incentives. We are getting close to wrap up. And I do want to go back to where we are with Sung, which is, you've got a book coming out. Do you have a title for your book yet?
I do. I'm not quite ready to share it, but I do have a title.
Okay. So Sung has an untitled book that is due to be published in one way or another. It's going to be published in the summer, in the state that it's in. I wanna give the last words to Semin and Hesan. In addition to finishing his book, obviously most of Sung's time should be focused on taking care of his family, taking care of his mom especially, finishing the book itself, because if you don't have a finished book, then you have nothing to talk about. However, what are some small things that Sung could or should carve some time out between now and the book launch, so that when the book launches, there's an audience that is ready and willing to pay for the book? So Sam and Hassan, what do you guys think? Who wants to go first?
Well, I can go first. I think we do this a lot of. I think in the beginning, where you briefly mentioned how you do PDFs, snippets, launch that into a whole book, right? But rather than doing that, the more simple way is these ideas you have. I think. Well, first of all, I don't have experience writing a book, so I don't know how the process goes exactly. But I think you would have ideas that goes into chapters, right? So having those ideas not fully explained, but just raising opinions. So from the conversation we had this very short comment, which actually expanded into multiple ideas and different ideas. And just having that idea tossed out would be a great source of bringing more interest, bringing more opinions into the comments, where later when you have the book, you can actually share the book with the audience. So I think that would be a good thing. In a very practical way, just go on LinkedIn and post questions about it. Post 1 or 2 sentences about the thing you are working on in that specific day or week that you're writing about. Just put it out there and just let it roll. I think you have, like, I think people will have a good enough opinion about these different topics. Well, I mean, the reason why I recommend LinkedIn is if you put it on Facebook, you will be like just mentioning religion and mentioning these things will just go in a completely different, different ways. So putting it on a more professional platform will help you get more professional opinions, in my perspective.
So what kind of platform do you think he should join to publish these snippets?
Well, I mean, definitely LinkedIn. That's the first thing I can think about. I am not too familiar with other professional communities. Oh, definitely in our forum as well. That would be great to share because it's more private. And if you have opinions that are not well developed yet, you can have more, more of a closed opinion at first until you develop the idea. So that would be my opinion. I don't know if there is like a medical community. I have no experience or knowledge about that. So that could be another thing that you can think about as well.
And Hassan, what do you think?
So I really enjoyed listening to your like book briefing, and I what was very interested is interesting. It was like you share some anecdotes that is related to those thoughts and those theories. So I think that's very fascinating, and that will be very make the readers they can relate their own experiences, so they can get inspired more. And even though like me, as someone who's not like quite um, familiar with neuroscience, that will be very easy to read, and they can help from your book. So I think like adding to that, I think maybe you can bring up those anecdotes and bring out more questions from that people can think about their own ideas from those stories. So you can share it on somewhere else and then get some more idea from that.
Like a warm up for the readers.
Yeah.
Maybe like a warm up before you read a book.
Yeah, or you can maybe you like warm up, and you can think of more. So whenever I'm talking with Mario, so I just bring up random questions to him, and then that leads to more conversation, and he can think of more papers or theories that he read before, like that. So
that's so funny because like the question that you asked me that started this whole thing was, what's the connection between human-centered design and impact? And I was like, well, the short of it is we're going to do a Zoom call. We're going to invite Sung. We're going to invite Jose, and we're going to turn it into a full episode. All right. It's not the answer you expected right away, but I think it was good. So we have to wrap up now. I think that both of those feedback are important, right? Take some snippets of it, even if it's not the book as a whole pre-published. You can take book excerpts. You can take ideas, post them on LinkedIn, or create your own website. And then, as Hassan said, also engage with people, especially those that are not in a medical background. I think that this topic of being reactive versus anticipatory by itself, I mean, we just started talking about it, and as soon as we started talking about it, we started realizing how many different areas that it applies to within the medical field, within the business field. And I think that's something that it has legs for a long time. You can run with small examples and conversations and articles just talking about how this concept applies to many areas, which is not necessarily content that would be within the book. But then if people want to have a more deeply detailed medical interpretation, then they buy the book. and then they get to see how you are writing about all of these things from the perspective of the history of science, the history of medicine, you know, and how, you know, technologies and new systems have been slowly introduced over time. I promised you guys a little bit earlier that I would try to find the name of the developer who we had met at Hub Week. I couldn't find her. I want to share with you a quick screen of what I did find, which is Jose had shared with me a set of companies from MIT that are doing something in AR. And the reason she was in my mind was because one of the companies is this one that is developing AI, AR, and novel computer vision plus edge computing, which are all very high level technologies for the sake of making visual displays. And one of the projects that they have is called SuperSense, and it's an application for the visually impaired. It uses the camera and it processes the information in the camera to give, you know, tactile and auditory feedback to the user. And the developer who we met that is in this picture. That's her right here. And I was trying to go on here to see if I could find her name. I couldn't. I don't know if she is part of the formal team. I didn't have a chance to look up every single one of them, but you know, her name just doesn't jump out at me. And it just goes to show that there are people who are working on these things. They are working to make these applications more accessible. And I think that as a very, very brief example, this kind of one-pager Sung, this one-pager website doesn't take a whole bunch of time and energy and effort, and it's something that you could do. You know, a very, very simple idea. You don't have a title yet, but you could have a title for, you know, who you are and what you're trying to do, and just taking snippets of the book can help you populate a website like this, where you say, coming this summer, leave your email, and have, you know, clips and images and media of who you are and the work that you have done. That article that you mentioned from when you were in college, that was and the essay that you mentioned that you had in college, do you still have that essay available?
I do actually.
Yeah, post it. That's like your blog post number one. It's not book content, but it's your content that tells your story and your narrative leading you up to, you know, these narratives are powerful. I mean, at least for me, and it's something that I would tell this company is, hey, she has a very powerful narrative. She's done a lot of interesting things. Make a blog post about her. People want to know, right? Aside from the SuperSense app, who is she? What has she done? And then a quick testimonial about, oh yeah, and this app is great, would help this company go a long way. And in the same way, you could do something like that. Talk about the professors that you've worked with, the research that you've done. Other times that I've talked to you, you just have so many interesting projects that you've been a part of. And all of that can be content leading up to, especially content that you just already have stored in your hard drive. Break it up into chunks, break it up into snippets, put it on the website, put it as blog posts and little clips on social media. That'll drive up demand so that when your book launches, you're going to have some people who are, you know, ready and willing to buy. I hate to have the last word on that note, because that was mostly Semen's and Hessan's ideas. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. I had a pending thing, and I can use this as an example right away to show you what Semen and Hessan were talking about. So
can I add one little thing?
Yeah, I was about to say, Jose and Sung, do you guys want to have a last thought before we finish the call?
Let me follow up on what Semen mentioned, which is using LinkedIn, for example, not just to post things, but also to reach out to people in your field, people who may give you feedback, who may be willing, based on what many of these, let's call them celebrities these days, entrepreneurial celebrities and the like. They one common theme is that they have found that people are very willing to respond to you to a very honest and inquisitive question. For example, there was a young woman who had written a book. She approached Deepak Chopra and said, would you mind reading this and tell me what you think about it? he did, not only that, he ended up writing a foreword for it.
Wow.
Because he found it amazing. Now she works for him. If I were you, and looking at the fast goals, which one of them is ambitious, I would send either a direct message on Instagram or LinkedIn to the likes of V.S. Ramachandran or David Eagleman, to mentioning some of your central tenets, right? And say, what do you think about this? Could I have a short chat with you? You never know what that kind of conversation can lead to. That can lead to having David Eagleman write, the preface to your book, which is like, wow, So I would certainly, on the ambitious side, it takes a few minutes, and the return on investment could be enormous.
Right.
I just want to thank all of you for all that feedback. I mean, it's just like, wow, what a gift I received this morning. Hisan, you emailed me this morning and asked to, just to remind me about the seminar, and Semin, your comment about reaching out, and Mario, your questions. And I mean, I really appreciate it. It really is just, wow, just a wealth of great stimulation. And, two of the things that Mario and Jose, you mentioned, I love those. Jose, actually, I met David Eagleman for 5 minutes at an event in the Bay Area, 3 years ago. And he might remember me. So thank you for reminding me of that. Because I will reach out to him again. And Mario, your quote about Gretzky, that's perfect. I have actually used that same quote from Gretzky in more than one document as a way to explain the allostasis paradigm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you might have even, the last time we were talking about that, you might have even been the one to tell me about it, and I just kind of remember. I have this habit of taking other people. It's like, I just remembered somewhere. I'm sure you didn't just mention it. But no, it was great. I'm glad that we could be helpful. It's really great to see, how you've been making progress along those lines, and we can't wait, so as you share stuff, please let us know, and we'd be happy to reshare on our page as well, and help people, learn a little bit about what you're trying to do. I think your message is very interesting, and I think it can help people gain some context for a lot of the things they are facing in their lives right now. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for joining. Semin Hassan, thanks for helping us to set up the call and giving us some feedback. Jose, thank you for joining all the way from Boston.
My pleasure.
I know you guys are heading into probably the two most interesting weeks of a very long time. and Son, thanks a lot for being a good sport and just putting yourself out there, joining in and sharing with us. All right, so I hope all of you guys have a really good day. Let's keep in touch, and we'll be back with another broadcast next Thursday at the same time. All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.